South Dakota is a donut hole in a lot of ways. Basically, the lack of Amtrak is just another one of them.
Take a good look at this map. It's a map that shows passenger railroad service across the lower 48 states. Do you notice anything odd about the routes? How about that big hole, that big donut hole where the state of South Dakota is? Yeah, no passenger rail going through our neck of the woods. Apparently, it's been that way for quite some time, since the 1960s, as a matter of fact.
Well, the first railroad, of course, came into what is now South Dakota in 1872, and that reached Yankton. But it wasn't until the late 1890s that we got a lot of service out in the Black Hills. Basically, every line that ever operated in South Dakota had one form or another of passenger service over the course of its history.
So we'd have a freight line, and they would also include passenger service.
Correct.
Probably servicing the mining industry.
Mining, logging, just general business. Everything ran by rail. But the one thing you have to consider is that all railroad passenger service had to be subsidized by freight or mail service or other baggage service or whatever. Rail service serving passengers only never made money on its own and enough to cover expenses. So freight service in one form or another has always had to have a subsidy.
Okay, so how many lines are we talking about here during the height of passenger rail service, so to speak?
Well, the South Dakota Railroad Museum has maps and everything talking about basically the zenith of railroading, which was about 1916. At that time, there were over 4,400 miles of track in South Dakota, and all but a few of those miles had passenger service. Now, you get back down into the 1940s, 1950s, it started diminishing because of highways, because of automobile traffic, airlines and all of that. So now we get down to a situation here in 2024 that we're down to like 1,800 miles of track, and that's exclusively freight service. Our last passenger trains in South Dakota operated through Edgemont in 1969, was the very last one in the summer of 1969.
Again, it's what I call the legacy lag effect on how individual railroads were rationalizing their own systems prior to Amtrak. And then the system, as it was handed over to Amtrak in 1971, has largely dictated the skeletal nature we have today. So it's really trying to get people to conceptualize that certain key links were left off the map, not for lack of need or viability. It's just because of that historical narrative prior to Amtrak. Different railroads had a history of not cooperating with one another, or sometimes maybe had a history of deliberately not cooperating with one another. But that should not limit our opportunities today. And it's really been since that time, since we've been off the map prior to Amtrak, is why it's been maybe a harder lift, or the hardest lift nationally, for us to be on the map or be considered for passenger rail service.
Let's talk about this entity known as Amtrak. It's one of those fuzzy sort of things that it's like the U.S. Postal Service or maybe the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Yep. It's a private entity, and the goal is to make a profit, but when it comes right down to it, it gets a lot of federal funding and it gets a lot of federal oversight. Is that Amtrak?
Partially, but I would clarify that Amtrak is not there to make a profit. It's statutorily not there to make a profit. They're to be prudent with the fiscal dollar, but they're there to provide a key national network service, and that is in their incorporation documents as the National Passenger Rail Corporation of America. There is to provide a service nationally, where that before Amtrak, that the private railroads were unable to do themselves, and that's why they're looking at the national system, and that we're seeing it as not the be-all end-all, but as one part of an interconnected transportation network there to complement and enhance what we have with our highway system, with our aviation system, and so on.
Then why is it when you mention the word Amtrak, you get a lot of people who think, well, it's like the Postal Service. It's got to make a profit. It's got to have good return on investment. And you're telling me that's not the point.
Exactly, so it's not there, it's there to provide the service there for the American people there. I mean, to think about that, a lot of misconceptions with our national transportation system is that our national transportation system across the board is heavily subsidized, not just Amtrak getting federal funding that way, but our national highway system, we'll build it out to a tune of over $100 billion with the bipartisan infrastructure law. Same way with airports and other modes of transportation like that, when you think about centralized air traffic control, the FAA, and so on there. So we're wanting to be prudent with the fiscal dollar, but talking about profitability really misses the point. What is the value to the American taxpayer here?
These days, Amtrak is the nation's passenger train company. More than 62,000 people take a ride on Amtrak trains every day. Amtrak runs through major urban areas and some places carrying more passengers than the airlines do. It also runs through hundreds of miles of less populated areas, those vast open spaces. Case in point, our neighbors to the north in North Dakota. Most of the rails that Amtrak runs through now are on existing freight lines. Each state decides on what regulations need to be met for passenger rail service. Amtrak recently announced plans to double its ridership by the year 2040. The question is, will those plans include service for South Dakota? And then there are those misconceptions about this entity known as Amtrak.
It is a public service, just like building a mile of interstate. You have to put money into it.
Or the mail.
Or the mail, exactly. The U.S. Mail. There's another quasi-governmental agency that we love to make, light of in some ways, but yet it's a very necessary service.
Why aren't you people making a profit?
Why are you always raising stamp rates? It's a hard sell to put tax money towards anything, especially railroads, when a lot of people don't realize that basically Amtrak is a tenant on freight railroads.
Other countries around the world have embraced passenger rail service for decades now, but not the United States. So why is that? Well, there's an interesting historical footnote when it comes to that situation.
A lot of money was put into the redevelopment of Europe as well as Japan by the United States after World War II. Those systems of rail were rebuilt and they were built to those standards. So later on, when the bullet trains in Japan as well as the lines in Europe were conceived and built, they were ready to go.
Let me make sure I'm hearing that correctly. The reason why Europe, would Japan be included in that as well?
Yes, it would.
The reason why they embrace passenger rail more so is due to the U.S. going back after World War II and rebuilding the systems?
Yes.
That's amazing.
It's amazing and it's sobering at the same time.
Instead of pursuing passenger rail service, the U.S. went down the road of car culture and travel by air. In the State Department of Transportation's latest long-term transportation plan, it talks about air travel, bus service for public transit, and freight rail lines, but no mention of passenger rail service. The DOT claims South Dakota doesn't have the population to justify a passenger rail line. But North Dakota has less population than we do, and it has an Amtrak line running from one end of the state to the other, bringing in more than $300 million every year for that state. And Wyoming, again with a smaller population, is pushing hard right now for a passenger rail line from Cheyenne to Denver. The DOT also claims there's insufficient demand from the public for a passenger rail line, and that may be true.
Well, I think that probably the folks that are making the case for it now are doing a great service. But so much has happened in the last 50 years or so that has diminished the possibility and potentially the need. If we'd have continued with passenger service in one form or another all the way through and maybe had some Amtrak service in the interim, maybe the state would take a bit more serious look at it. I don't know. I know that any of us that love to ride passenger trains, and I'm totally biased, know that it's a good way to go, but once again, you would require a subsidy, which is coming a little bit more from the U.S. government now in the form of passenger subsidies, but also there would have to be a buy-in from the state of South Dakota and some of the municipalities. Rapid City and Sioux Falls would probably have to make a real case for service to be there, but I think there might be other options that we could pursue as a state to get back on the system to a certain extent.
The most critical thing for them to get, or a different approach with passenger rail, a different sort of recognition, is for people to be vocal about their genuine interest to see these things explored. We're not asking for people to blindly sign their lives away or sign their life away in blood that they want to see it happen, but asking for the idea to be thoroughly explored from every angle possible and truly understand what passenger rail could bring, what is the right contextualization for passenger rail out here, and what it can actually do for our economy and communities. And the most important thing with it for people to be vocal to their local and state officials, your state legislator, and then also to be vocal to our congressional delegation and the Federal Railroad Administration to say, hey, we would like to be considered for passenger rail service. Please look into it and to really understand what it can actually do for us out here.
Here we've been without passenger service in any way, shape, or form for 50 years. Before that, it was never a big thing after World War II. The last passenger service, let's say into Rapid City, was 1960. Sioux Falls, 1965. The last one into Aberdeen was 1969. The state collectively has forgotten about railroading and hauling passengers. Freight service, that's an entirely different story. So much of the money that's available for subsidies, grants, upgrades has gone to freight service.
A few governmental groups have been weighing in on the issue and expressing an interest, at least, in more study on the matter. Pennington County likes the idea, and the commission wrote a letter to the Federal Railroad Administration. In fact, the county commission wrote 2 letters stating its support for the idea of passenger rail service and connecting it to local tourist attractions like Mount Rushmore or maybe the Badlands. So you write this letter expressing your concern that you would like to see further study into this possibility of passenger rail coming here. What kind of response did you get?
We haven't heard anything.
Okay. And how long ago was that?
This was back in August, I believe, of last year.
Okay. Interesting.
And from the year before, I think it was May of 21.
So there are other governmental entities in the state of South Dakota that have expressed the same sort of thing. City of Sturgis, I know. Grant County officials have also written their own letter expressing the same sort of concern. Have you heard anything result-wise about those letters?
No, I haven't heard from Grant, but I heard Sturgis had. And as you guys are probably well aware of, years ago there was talk about a rail from our airport to Deadwood, someone trying to do that. And yeah, I haven't heard too much about any other commissions being involved or showing their support as of yet.
All right, so mainly what you're hearing is a whole lot of crickets chirping.
Well, I think it's a tough sell. It's a lot of money, and I think the federal funding was there, and you'd have to get the authority from the existing rail to take over some of the process of it and so forth. I think it's a lot of work nobody's really wanted to take on yet.
If our state depends so much on tourism, we've got some sites and places to visit that attract visitors from all over the world. It would just make sense to make it as easy as possible for them to access that. Right now, they're having to fly in, maybe to Rapid, for example, if they want to go to Rushmore, which is not cheap. Or they drive for hours and hours and hours again. I can't wrap my mind around why we don't hear more about this to accommodate the state's tourism.
Did you realize that subsidy is a 4-letter word? Yes, it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I get where you're going.
Yes. When you look at rebuilding and upgrading some of these railroad lines that do exist now only for freight in South Dakota, you would have to implement a new signaling system that would provide basic safety for the passenger trains. There are FRA, Federal Railroad Administration regulations that would have to be satisfied. You'd have to go in and put in all new signaling and crossing gates at many of the state highways.
Because of federal regulations?
Because of federal regulations and state regulations for that matter.
So what kind of an economic impact would a passenger rail line have if it ran through the entire state of South Dakota? How would it affect life in West 605, especially when it comes to tourism?
Wouldn't you love to get on a train in Rapid City in the evening, get in a sleeper, by the next morning you're in Sioux Falls, and get up and go to a business meeting?
Absolutely.
Who wouldn't love that? How about somebody flies into Sioux Falls, the next morning they're in Rapid City, able to do their tours and enjoy the Black Hills? What is not to love? Well, here's where your money, put your money where your mouth is. Yeah. Or anyway, it just, a lot of things would have to go a lot differently in South Dakota. We'd have to change our mindset. We would have to become less dependent on our cars, airlines, everything else, and we'd have to convince the state that it's a good thing to actually subsidize and get this rail service back into South Dakota.
Would visitors be interested in that, or looking to wanting a passenger rail connection there to experience the West 605, the Black Hills region, or just wanting to come out here to really try to conceptualize, especially for maybe some of our European tourists, the sheer amount of space that we're dealing with? You know, from here in Rapid to Sioux Falls, it's what, 340 miles, I believe, and just thinking about what that is on a broader level compared to some folks maybe coming from Europe that you have a lot of quite sizable communities within a stone's throw.
A lot of people are doing a lot of work between Rapid and Sioux Falls and Minnesota and so forth. And so I think it'd be not only a great alternative for people working, but also people through the state to be able to transportation from one side of the state to the other.
So, is passenger railroad service for South Dakota ever going to become a reality again? Or is it still just kind of pie in the sky sort of thinking?
Nostalgia will only get you so far, you know, because a lot of people now have never ridden a passenger train in South Dakota. I think if you give them the chance and give them a taste of it, and then also give them another option to actually get them on a train, maybe that will help. But to get the perception change, that's going to have to be done at a state level, I think. Or at least a lot of grassroots places, say Sioux Falls. Sioux Falls is growing exponentially. Rapid City is going to be doing the very same. You know, maybe find other pockets around the state that I think some of these pro-rail organizations are starting to try and tap into. I think maybe that could at least change the perception.
So maybe the growth that's happening here may fuel that.
Potentially,
okay.
Potentially. And, you know, every chance I get, I try and promote through the museum and through our other efforts. Travel by rail is a great way to go. And it's fuel efficient compared to other methods. And it's also a good, relaxing way to travel. And, you know, maybe we just need to find different ways to appeal to different groups. But as far as what we do to really change the state's perception of it. I don't know. That's a real hard sell, and I hope maybe we can find a way. But I think if you chip at it little by little, maybe you can.
The biggest takeaway, I guess I would say, for people, even if they're very skeptical about the feasibility about passenger rail and about if it would work or if they want to be supportive of it or not, I guess what we talk about with all aboard Northwest are what we call the 3 E's. That passenger rail brings economic benefits, it brings environmental benefits, and it brings equity benefits. And no matter where people might be in the political spectrum that way, we find at least 2 of the 3 resonate with different people all across the region. So really trying to recognize, even if a person themselves doesn't think that they'd ever want to use it or want to use it themselves, but to recognize what are the other benefits to especially our economy out here, and how passenger rail services, especially the long distance services we're advocating for, bring many times the rate of return on taxpayers' equities to the communities that it serves.
First of all, I think if you build it, they will come. I mean, people had the opportunity to ride on one and experience it and find out, try it and see how fast and more comfortable it is than flying on an airplane. I think it'd be more popular. It's more affordable.
Now, you've got some personal experience in this when it comes to passenger rail. Tell me a little bit about that.
I think my first experience is when I took a vacation, me and the wife, to Boston. We took the Amtrak from Boston to New York to see Penn Station, Grand Central Station. Great experience. I think it was like $35 for both of us. Timely, comfortable, enjoyed it. And then we did it again when we vacationed in San Diego. We took the Amtrak from San Diego to LA a couple times and back. And very beautiful ride and just enjoyed it.
So what do you think about the whole idea of bringing back passenger rail service to the state of South Dakota? Are you intrigued by the economic impact it could have? Do you like the idea of jumping on a train to go check out the state's biggest tourist attractions? Or maybe you like the way things are, the status quo, and you want to continue to invest in our highways, in our airports, and our freight rail systems. Well, whatever decision we make, whatever direction we go, let's make sure we're on the right track here in West 605.